What does it mean to do a stunt for real? It's a question that's been on my mind a lot recently, especially with movies like The Fall Guy putting real stunt work at the center of their marketing campaigns. But I really started thinking about it almost a year ago when I saw Mission Impossible: Dead Reckoning. As I'm sure you remember, in the lead up to its release, the internet was absolutely inundated with the so-called biggest stunt in movie history, which saw Tom Cruise himself motorbiking off a cliff into a base jump. And I was excited because the Mission Impossible movies are famous not only for delivering some of the most impressive and death-defying stunts in recent cinema, but also for the fact that they have their indispensable and very expensive lead actor doing them himself. No other movie series is doing that at this scale, and the results speak for themselves. But if you compare the bike jump in Dead Reckoning to some of the big stunts from the other Mission Impossible movies, then I think you'll understand why I wanted to make this video. In Ghost Protocol, there's the amazing scene with Tom Cruise climbing around the outside of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, which they did for real, and it looks like this in the promotional behind the scenes material, and it looks like this in the final movie. In Rogue Nation, there's the opening scene that sees Tom Cruise hanging onto the outside of a plane that's taking off, which they did for real, and it looks like this in the promotional behind the scenes material, and it looks like this in the final movie. In Fallout, there's the entire helicopter chase at the end, which they did for real, and it looks like this in the promotional behind the scenes material, and it looks like this in the final movie. But then in Dead Reckoning, you have the bike jump, which they did for real, but it looks like this in the promotional behind the scenes material, and it looks like this in the final movie. In the first three examples, the stunt was done for real, the marketing played up the fact that the stunt was done for real, and then the movie came out and it looked real because it looked like the promotional material with the safety wires edited out, because that is basically what we're looking at. But in Dead Reckoning, the stunt was done for real, the marketing played up the fact that it was done for real, but then the movie came out and it looked like Tom Cruise was driving along a computer-generated ramp-shaped bit of cliff, because that is basically what we're looking at. So it got me thinking about what exactly does it mean to do a stunt quote-unquote for real. Because I think for most people, when we hear that something was done for real or was done practically, we're thinking about things like this, or this, or this, or this, when pretty much everything we see in the final shot was photographed in a camera. But what I see happening more and more is that filmmakers are putting in a huge amount of time, effort, expense, and risk to pull off a big real stunt, then audiences get hyped up on a bunch of promo material showing off all that real stunt work, but then end up feeling underwhelmed when they watch the final movie because, oh, that's how they hit the ramp? But then on the other hand, you have scenes like this one that also replace a huge amount of the frame with digital elements but look totally believable. Or you have a shot like this, which is pretty much entirely filmed in camera but still looks kind of fake, right? So what's going on here? Well, that's what we're here to find out. So in this video, we're going to look at this idea of realism in stunt work and why it is so much more nuanced than just whether or not any CGI is being used. We're going to look at the history of stunt work, how digital effects have changed the game for stunts, and the challenges that modern filmmakers face when trying to pull off big stunts in a realistic way. But we're also going to take a step back and ask what exactly we mean by a real stunt in the first place. Because I think the term is being increasingly exaggerated in movie marketing that is trying to convince us that absolutely everything we see is practical, and it results in deliberately misleading featurettes like this one.
Apply all of that knowledge to something practical and real. No one else in the world is doing this level of practical filmmaking. To shoot it practically was extremely challenging.
It talks about how the train fight was done for real, and they show us all the footage of it being done for real to prove it, but pay attention to what they do here.
He's gonna now pull me off the train.
See how they cut between the behind the scenes shots and shots from the final movie? Yeah, that's because they actually filmed a lot of this scene in the safety of a studio, using the real footage as reference material to fill in the backgrounds. But to find that out, you have to track down ILM's VFX breakdown. If you just saw the marketing featurette, you'd think it was all filmed on the train for real. And this wasn't always how movies were marketed. As recently as 2015, Mission Impossible movies were open about how they used a blend of digital and real effects to pull off their big stunts.
There was literally no way for us to shoot that sequence in a real environment. And so we animated the entire sequence.
So it's clear something has changed in how movies are marketing their so-called real stunts, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do, let's take a look at this question of what a real stunt actually is, and more importantly, does it matter? But before we go any further, I should make two disclaimers. The first is about CGI, which we will get into in detail in a second, but I want to make it really clear right from the start that this is not going to be a video where I talk about how great practical stunt work is and how terrible CGI is, because not only is that such a boring take, it's also just wrong. Most digital effects are completely invisible to audiences, so even though I am going to be talking about how they are used in stunt work, this video is actually more about the fact that just doing something practically is not a guarantee of realism. But we'll get to that. The second disclaimer is that I actually really like all of the movies I'm going to be talking about in this video, and this video is not intended as a criticism of the movies or of the work that went into making them. No, the focus of this video is on this idea of realism in stunt work, and what it means for both the films themselves and the way in which they're advertised. And the reason I'm focusing on Mission Impossible so much is because those movies have consistently set the highest possible standard for realism and practical stunt work. They have given us some of the most ambitious, exciting, and impressive stunts in modern cinema, and I absolutely love that this series keeps pushing those boundaries for our entertainment. But if even those movies begin to blur the lines of realism by insisting that everything they are doing is real, even when it is not, just to sell the movie, then audiences are eventually going to notice that the Emperor has no clothes. But we'll get to that as well. So first, let's start with a very oversimplified history lesson. For much of the 20th century, if you wanted to show some sort of visual effect on screen, then you more or less had to capture it in camera, be that with miniatures, compositing, matte painting, stunt doubles, puppets, stop motion, rear projection, you get it.
It's only a model. Shh.
This also meant that stunts had to be done more or less exactly as they're shown on screen, and this could obviously be very dangerous. Over time, the stunt profession and filmmaking as an art form evolved in a way that made stunt work safer for performers and often more convincing on screen. But movies have always been about creating illusions and fooling the audience, and stunts are no different. So when we talk about this idea of a real stunt, generally we're thinking of and talking about stunts that were captured in camera somehow, even if movie magic was needed to hide the seams. Like, yes, this is real skydiving, but it's not real skydiving without a parachute, which is what the movie is trying to show. The stunt performers are wearing parachutes hidden under their jackets, but we would still consider this a real stunt because you have real people doing the thing and are capturing that effect in camera to tell the story in a convincing and realistic way. So that's how stunts and other visual effects worked for the first 7 or 8 decades of cinema until the arrival of digital effects. This changed the game because all of a sudden, filmmakers could show things on screen that were completely impossible to capture in a camera, and this extended to stunt work. One of the reasons audiences got so excited about early digital effects was because for their whole lives, when they watched a movie and something super impressive happened that they had never seen before, they went, "How did they do that?" And with stunts, the answer was almost always, someone actually did that. But today, it's different. See, because digital effects have been widely used in movies for over 30 years at this point, when modern audiences see something on screen that they have never seen before, their default assumption will be that it was faked using digital effects, even if it wasn't.
I think it speaks to the idea that if something feels impossible, I think we just tend to assume that it is impossible and therefore faked.
And what that means is that filmmakers today who want to both do their stunts for real and convince audiences that they did it for real have a really high barrier to overcome, because if the stunt looks too impossible, audiences will just assume that it's fake. So studios and filmmakers find themselves in this position where the only way they can convince audiences that their stunt was not faked with CGI is to show them a bunch of behind the scenes material that proves that they did it for real. Which is fine for things like this and this. But with something like this, well, to prove they did the jump for real, they have to show us what it looks like without CGI, which just makes the CGI all the more obvious, which makes it look fake in the final movie. So let's talk about CGI.
It's impossible.
To reiterate what I said just now, I want to make it really clear that this is not a video saying CGI is bad, because it isn't. CGI is a filmmaking tool like lighting and costume, and like any filmmaking tool, it can be used well and it can be used poorly. The fact that audiences don't notice it 99% of the time is a testament to the skill of the VFX workers, who are typically overworked, underpaid, underacknowledged by studios, and underappreciated by audiences. In case you haven't already seen them, the Movie Rabbit Hole channel made an excellent series of videos called No CGI is Really Just Invisible CGI, where a professional VFX artist busts a huge amount of myths about how and why digital effects are used in movies. Oh, he also explains why CGI is kind of a meaningless term to VFX artists, but it's also a convenient shorthand to use in videos like this one, which is why you're going to hear me say it a lot. But another focus of those videos is also on highlighting how studios love telling audiences that they did everything for real with no CGI, when in reality, this couldn't be further from the truth. Every modern action movie you have seen that claims to be doing stunts for real actually uses some combination of real and digital effects, and most of the time, audiences can't tell the difference, and that's exactly how it should be. But we'll come back to the movie marketing because I want to look at the use of digital effects and stunt work and what that means for the realism of the stunt. Because I'm not saying that there should be no CGI in stunt work, that's just ridiculous. As we have just seen, stunt work is incredibly dangerous, and even today, people still die or get seriously injured because of stunts that go wrong. One of the best things about the advent of digital effects is that it has allowed stunt work to become a lot more predictable and safer, but in a way that still preserves the authenticity of the real stunt, and I think audiences accept this. They understand that you're going to need to do things like remove safety wires and crash mats. They know you need to composite in a background or a foreground, or extend a frame, or change the set for continuity reasons, or swap out trainers for high heels, or film things in a more controlled studio environment, or edit out the piston from the cannon that flips the truck. For me, this is no different from stunt performers wearing protective pads underneath their costumes when they get dragged along the ground, or using rubber swords instead of steel ones, or having roll cages inside of cars to protect the driver, or falling onto crash mats hidden out of frame, or, just to gross you out, wearing protective contact lenses so that Tom Cruise doesn't get blinded by a bug. Like the parachutes under the jackets, these are all things that are there for the safety of the performer but are invisible to the audience. CGI is just another tool filmmakers have at their disposal that has allowed them, thankfully, to move past the days where the only way to achieve this stunt was by actually dropping Jackie Chan 3 stories onto his head. But this is where we come back to that barrier that modern filmmakers need to overcome. See, because modern audiences know that anything is possible with CGI, if filmmakers want to pull off a stunt for real today, and if they want to convince audiences that it is real, then they need to tread a fine line between what's impressive and what's just straight up impossible. Because in all of the examples I've just shown you, the reason the final stunt looks realistic is because the stunt is still theoretically possible without CGI. Let me show you what I mean. This stunt can only be done safely by using CGI to remove the safety wires, but theoretically, it would be possible without them. It would be dangerous, but it would be possible. So the CGI here is only complementing something that is both being done for real and that is possible to achieve without CGI. So when we see it with CGI, we believe what we are seeing because, yeah, if a guy jumped off the back of a truck, that's what it would look like. The same goes for this, and this, and this. But then you have something like this, that Marvel developed to allow stunt performers to run at super speed. This is a practical effect that captures just as much of the stunt in camera as this does, with only minimal CGI being needed to edit out the rig and harness. But because we know that humans can't actually run that fast, when we see it in the final movie, we assume it's fake because this is only possible to achieve on film if you are using some sort of digital effect. And because these movies use so many digital effects for so many other things, it's natural that audiences will also assume that a shot like this is also just done with digital effects, not practical ones. Or to use another example, there's the Halo jump in Mission Impossible Fallout. Now, this was another amazing stunt done for real by Tom Cruise himself that was all filmed in one take that took a ridiculous amount of time to plan and choreograph.
We've been doing 5 jumps a day out of the Twin Otter. In the afternoons, we'll do 3 C-17 jumps.
There's dangers of hypoxia and the bends. We have to shoot it as close to sunset as we can, so we have exactly 3 minutes every day to get the shot.
And this is kind of what we see in the final movie, but in the final movie, a crucial part of the scene involves Henry Cavill getting struck by lightning, which is impossible to do without CGI. So again, the realism of this stunt has less to do with the quality of the CGI itself and more from the fact that your brain inherently understands it to be faked somehow because of course Henry Cavill didn't actually get struck by lightning on camera. So even though this whole thing was shot for real, an essential part of it had to be faked, and to me, that undermines the realism of the entire scene because if you see something that looks fake, then you are probably going to think it was faked digitally, because that's how your brain has been trained to respond when it is seeing something in a movie that it thinks is impossible.
If something feels impossible, I think we just tend to assume that it is impossible and therefore faked.
Now, this is a more extreme example than this, but in both cases, the issue of realism is not because of the quality of the CGI or even the existence of CGI, but rather it's about the design of the stunt itself and whether or not it is plausible that it could be done for real. Like, this scene is actually my favorite one in Dead Reckoning, and this uses way more CGI than both the Halo jump in Fallout or the bike jump. But because everything we're watching is completely plausible, it still looks and feels more realistic because this is pretty much what it would look like if they actually dropped a load of furniture onto Tom and Haley. They just didn't do that because this is obviously way safer and the final outcome looks pretty much the same. But this brings us to the inevitable question. If a stunt is going to rely on CGI in order to work, and if CGI is so convincing, and if it makes it safer for stunt performers, then what's the point of doing it for real?
Because it was real.
Well, there are lots of reasons for doing a stunt for real, but one of the main ones is that everyone is working off the same page. Everyone on this set knows how the scene is going to look in the final movie because it's just going to look like this. That's not the case on this set, where everyone has a completely different mental picture of the scene.
And you go into this door right here.
That door.
That door, the red door.
When it's all there for real, you can block, choreograph, and frame everything exactly as it needs to be, and everyone can work towards the same outcome at the same time. And the best thing about this is that even if you are going to use digital effects in the final movie, physical objects existing on set or on location with the correct lighting and proportions and so on gives the visual effects teams all of the reference material they need to replicate them exactly in a digital environment. So if you need to film some of the more dangerous parts of the sequence in a studio, you can do that using the real world footage for reference. You can film only a small number of real objects and then multiply them out to create your army and not hurt any people or horses if you need to kill some of them. Filming 200 guys and turning them into 20,000 is much cheaper and safer than actually getting 20,000 extras to stand around in a desert like they did in the 60s, but audiences are none the wiser. In short, it means you get the best of both worlds. The authenticity and tactility of real objects existing in a real space and being photographed in a camera, but blending them with realistic digital elements in a hopefully seamless way to create something that would just be too impractical to do for real. And this is also why miniatures work so well, by the way. Filming things for real also gives everyone a head start on post-production. Having shots like this means people like the editor, composer, sound technician, so on can all start working on the scene using these shots as their references, instead of having to wait for the VFX work to be finished. Having real-life reference material also means visual effects artists can do things like help fix errors in a scene instead of doing reshoots. Like this stunt in No Time to Die is real.
We had an amazing special effects team that really did, and a stunt team that really did jump Land Rovers through the air. On a James Bond film, no one really wants to resort to CGI stunts and things like that. So they really do capture everything in camera.
But the shots leading up to it are digital, made using the real cars as references.
But when they, for sort of timing reasons, they take a chunk out of the middle of a chase, suddenly the continuity of where those vehicles are and where they need to be sort of goes out the window. That's when we do come in and we find a plate that maybe has got the Toyota in it, which is Bond's car, but it doesn't have the Land Rovers there. So we'll erase the motorbike, but we'll put the Land Rovers in.
This is so much easier and cheaper than refilming the entire scene to fix the timing issue, and the audience has no idea when they watch it. But you can only do that because you filmed 95% of the scene for real. And using the real elements to support VFX like this is something that extends beyond stunt work too. In Dune, they used real helicopters landing to kick up the dust in a realistic way, and then replace them with the digital ornithopters. Top Gun Maverick did the same thing. This is an actual jet flying over the set, but the jet itself was digitally replaced with the fancy one you see in the movie. And this is all an extension of the point I made earlier in the video, that when CGI is being used to do something that is still possible without CGI, generally audiences don't notice it. Like, yeah, no shit you spotted that this was CGI. It's not so easy when it's this, is it? Doing stunts for real also makes the physics work. We've all seen the clips of things like this that make the car look like a toy, but if you're doing the stunt for real, then you avoid things like that happening. So when someone gets pulled out of a car falling off a bridge, or jumps onto a truck, or a car crashes, all you need to do is erase the safety equipment and you're left with something that looks authentic because it is authentic. You get a truck flip that looks like this and not like this. But this is why filmmakers need to be careful when they do stunts that are meant to be realistic but that seem to defy the laws of physics. Now obviously it's fine to defy reality in a superhero movie or a big popcorn blockbuster like a Fast and the Furious movie, but it's not fine if your goal is realism. Like take this scene in The Fall Guy where you actually have Ryan Gosling getting dragged behind a truck in Sydney, then fighting a stunt guy in the back of a skip that's also being dragged around behind the truck. Practical stunt work, right? But see how the skip has this kind of weightless quality and it's just smoothly kind of drifting over the ground? Well, that's because that's what it's doing. So even though almost all of the stunt was captured in camera, the physics don't work because the skip was designed to be suspended in the air like this rather than actually interacting with the ground. And when the physics don't work, we assume it's fake. Oh, it also doesn't help that the filmmakers applied that awful low contrast desaturated color grade that makes it look like a Marvel movie and therefore like bad CGI, but that's another video. The point of showing this scene is to show how even if you're doing everything practically and only using minimal CGI to remove safety equipment and so on, it's still not a guarantee that the stunt will look realistic in the final movie. Which brings us back to this. Because if you apply everything I've just been talking about to this stunt, then it should be pretty realistic, right? This was filmed on location. Well, it was mostly filmed on location, so ILM had all of the reference material they needed to make a pretty good recreation of the wider landscape to mask the ramp in the same way the team working on No Time to Die could replace the ground in those scenes. You could argue that the digital replacement of the ground in this shot is no different from this, or the desert being replaced with Paris during the Halo jump in Fallout. In all of these cases, the purpose of the CGI is primarily cosmetic. The stunt does not need the CGI to be here in order to work, it only needs it to tell the story. But it does need the ramp to work. Like, yes, theoretically it is possible to do this without the ramp, it would just be very dangerous and unpredictable with all the rocks and the uneven ground and the lack of an upward slope and so on, so of course they needed a ramp to do it safely. And if you have a ramp, then you need to hide it somehow, and obviously the easiest way to do that is with CGI. But here's the problem with this stunt specifically, because Dead Reckoning chose to build its marketing around this stunt, which meant they had to show everyone the giant ramp. So it doesn't matter how good the CGI is, audiences are going to see through the illusion because they know it's not real, which means they're going to be a bit underwhelmed when they see the movie because the scene in the movie looks worse than the behind the scenes material they've already seen. So my question is, if you are going to show audiences the ramp before they have seen the movie, then why not design the stunt in such a way as to incorporate the ramp into the final shot?
Sorry, okay, this isn't what I wanted.
Who am I supposed to build ramps for? Who am I supposed to build ramps for now?
Like a lot of things in the Mission Impossible movies, James Bond did it first, and the same is true for the bike jump in Dead Reckoning. That is stuntman Jacques Melnui motorbiking off a cliff into a base jump 25 years or so before Tom Cruise called his the biggest stunt in movie history. Anyway, see how this is filmed from below so that the ramp just ends up looking like the end of the runway from the shots beforehand? Well, they did that because it would hide the fact that they were doing the stunt in a completely different location and to mostly hide the ramp that they had built to pull off the stunt.
The bike and the plane will be coming toward me, come off the ramp right behind me. The primary camera position is down on the next ledge. They'll have 3 cameras set up there, getting a profile of the shot.
Now, I know Dead Reckoning filmed it like this so that you could see it as Tom Cruise doing the jump himself, but it's so easy to replace actors' heads on stunt guys these days that unfortunately, this doesn't prove anything anymore. Remember what I said about the high barrier filmmakers today have to overcome to convince audiences that they did this stunt for real? Yeah, this is the sort of thing I was talking about. If you did this in the 80s, then sure, you could film it like this and that would be enough to convince people that this was actually the lead actor doing the stunt. Or would it? Fun fact, this isn't actually Arnold Schwarzenegger but stunt driver Peter Kent wearing a prosthetic face, which, to me, is exactly the same as this. Oh, and they also had the bike on ropes that they removed digitally, but anyway, the point is that in today's world of terrifyingly convincing deepfakes, the close-up isn't enough. No, the reason we know that this is Tom Cruise himself is not because we can see his face in the shot, but because we have seen legions of promotional material making damn sure we know it's Cruise himself. So this is where we need to look at the design of the stunt and how it fits into the wider scene. In GoldenEye, this is just one shot, after which we move on to some wide shots of stuntman BJ Worth actually skydiving, and some shonky ones of Pierce Brosnan on a green screen. So as cool as this stunt is, it quickly becomes very obvious that this is not all being done for real. But because Tom Cruise actually did this jump, Dead Reckoning has the advantage over GoldenEye because they have all of these shots of Cruise actually falling, which look fantastic and are more than enough to prove that he did the jump for real. But despite that, this scene was still designed in such a way that the giant ramp would be visible in the final take, whereas the jump in GoldenEye was designed so that the ramp would be hidden. And yes, in Mission Impossible, they're hiding the ramp by making it look like part of the landscape. And that's fine in principle, but again, because they were always planning on showing us this to prove that it was done for real, it's going to end up being underwhelming when we see it in the final movie. So if they wanted to film it in this way, then why wasn't the scene designed in a way that incorporated the ramp into the story? For example, in the 1974 James Bond movie The Man with the Golden Gun, sorry, if you're new here, we really like James Bond on this channel, there's a famous stunt which for some reason has this sound effect. I mean, can you imagine? This stunt is done for real, and like the bike jump in Dead Reckoning, the ramp had to be perfectly designed to have this exact shape, and the car had to be going at the perfect speed to pull it off. But see how in the final shot, the ramp the car is driving up is facing away from the camera? In the movie, that side of the ramp looks like this, but in reality, it looked like this. They hid the smooth bit of the ramp that the stunt driver needed through how they framed the shot, and by dressing the set in such a way that the ramp just looked like part of the destroyed bridge. In other words, they designed the stunt in such a way that they could include the ramp itself in the final shot in a convincing way. They built everything you see in this shot. The actual river had no buildings or anything on it, but they were all put there to make the bridge look like part of the landscape. And for the record, this is why all of this scaffolding is here for Tom Cruise's big running jump in Mission Impossible Fallout. Instead of hiding it by extending the building with CGI, they just dressed the set so that it all blended in and looked real, meaning they didn't have to hide it. So why couldn't Dead Reckoning have done something similar? Like, this entire scene is contrived from the start to get Tom Cruise up the mountain to do the stunt. So why not also contrive a reason for the ramp to be there so that you can have it look as real as possible in both the promotional material and the final movie, like all the other Mission Impossible stunts did? Why not, for example, make the cliff top be a ski resort closed for the summer? Something like this, or even, I don't know, something like this? Not only would it be more realistic for the story because Benji would be directing Ethan up a road to an actual town, but it also means that you could disguise the man-made structure of the ramp much more neatly because there would be other man-made structures nearby, like they did with the scaffolding in Fallout.
Build him a town. Fast.
This is exactly what they did with the bike jump in No Time to Die. They built a ramp and then hid it digitally by making it look like part of the wall. Now, this still doesn't look perfect, but it's a hell of a lot less obvious than a ridgeline looking like this. But more importantly, the scene as a whole is shot in a way that the digital elements take up far less of the frame and are on screen for a short enough amount of time that you don't really have a chance to notice them. The same goes for the ramps in Fury Road. Lots of the ramps in this scene are in fact digital, but the shots move so fast that we never really have time to notice or even think that they could be digital. In both cases, the ramps are hidden with digital effects, yes, but the scene is also designed so that they are not in frame for long enough to be noticed. In Dead Reckoning, not only is the digital ramp in the money shot for over 10 seconds, but it also gets multiple close-ups, and in all, it ends up being on screen for just under a minute. So even if you ignore all the marketing, the movie itself actively draws attention to the fake ramp, rather than designing the scene in a way that hides it as much as possible. As impressive as it is, the Dead Reckoning stunt shoots itself in the foot because unlike these stunts, they chose to film it in a way that would draw as much attention as possible to the giant fake ramp. And what is even more frustrating is that even if you kept the scene like this, with Cruise biking off an empty cliff top, then you could still design it differently to create a more authentic looking final product. Like, why not rig up something like this with all the safety ropes that they used in the rehearsals to film him going off an actual cliff, but with the safety ropes, like they did in Mad Max, and then you can separately film Tom Cruise doing the base jump by using a helicopter. It means you can still get the money shot of Cruise motorbiking off a cliff, and because the final scene has a cut between this and this anyway, you'd get a result that looks just as authentic, but that wouldn't require 50% of the frame to be digital, because you wouldn't need a ramp anywhere near this big because you had the safety wires instead. Well, I think I know why they didn't do that, and it's because of...
It means time for the website to start generating revenue.
No, I know what the word means. I'm asking, how do you want to do it?
Advertising. No.
Despite what you may be thinking, having watched this much of the video, I do think that doing a big stunt for real and knowing it was done for real does make the scene more exciting for the audience. I know I was criticizing the lightning in this scene earlier, but knowing this is Tom Cruise actually falling to the ground is more exciting than watching Daniel Craig in a green screen wind tunnel. Just like knowing that this is actually Keanu Reeves is more exciting than it would be if we kept having to cut away to a stunt double. But movies do not exist in a vacuum, and as we've already seen, the reason we know that this is actually Tom Cruise or this is actually Keanu Reeves is not because of how the movie is shot or how realistic the effects are, but because the entire marketing campaign of the movie was built around making sure audiences know that this is actually Tom Cruise and this is actually Keanu Reeves. Even if it's not the main actors doing the stunts themselves, studios still love to talk up how many of their stunts they did for real so that you know they actually did this or this or this. But as Jonas showed us in his video series about invisible CGI, audiences have kind of been gaslit into believing this binary idea that all CGI looks fake and all practical things look real, which, as he showed in his videos and I hope I've shown in this one, is just ridiculously simplistic. This is a practical effect, but so is this. These are digital characters, but so are these. It's easy to cherry pick, but making sweeping generalizations just makes you look a bit stupid. But because studios have been increasingly pushing this narrative in how they market their movies, they have painted themselves into a corner where they can't show off or talk about all of the amazing VFX work being done to make their movies look good. They can only talk about the things they did for real.
But it's one thing to just make your movie with CGI so good the audience doesn't notice. It's another thing to respond to the audience's "we want less CGI" by making your movie with a ton of CGI, but promote it as no CGI, causing the audience to think that's it, it's good because it's practical, therefore we want less CGI.
So coming back to that example from the start of the video, in 2015 it was totally fine for Mission Impossible to put out a featurette about their big stunt where Tom Cruise holds his breath for 6 minutes, but they are also open about the use of digital effects to pull off the scene.
Most of the work that's done in the film is done in camera and is practical, but there was literally no way for us to shoot that sequence in a real environment. And so we animated the entire sequence.
Can you imagine hearing Tom Cruise say that today? In 2024, you never hear people admit that because audiences have become convinced that if a movie says it uses green screens and CGI, then it will end up looking like this, even though, in reality, most of the time it ends up looking like this. And the reason people think that about CGI is partly because of the way in which the industry has overworked VFX artists and pressured them into delivering projects on unrealistic schedules, resulting in a decline of quality in some of the more high-profile properties, which has given audiences a warped perception of what CGI looks like. But it's also because most big blockbusters between 2015 and 2023 were just very VFX heavy movies as opposed to more grounded films like the Mission Impossible series. So in that time, filmmakers like Christopher Nolan and movies like Top Gun Maverick and the Mission Impossible series and so on put a lot of effort into emphasizing the real elements of their movies to set themselves apart from these big spectacles, even though they actually use a similar amount of visual effects. As Jonas pointed out in his series, Top Gun Maverick has more visual effects shots than Black Panther, but because those visual effects shots look like this instead of like this, audiences don't notice them, and so they can be more easily convinced that the whole thing was done for real. But as we can see by comparing those Mission Impossible featurettes, studios no longer want to acknowledge that they used any CGI at all, even if the fact that they did is going to be very obvious in the final movie. And I think that is changing how the movies themselves are being made. Because when a scene in Dead Reckoning called for a train to crash off a bridge, they actually crashed a full-size train off a bridge, and it looks like this in the behind-the-scenes promo material, but then it looked like this in the final movie. God knows how much this cost, but so much of the final product ended up being CGI because they had to add the explosion and change the entire landscape to the extent that this shot might as well have just been fully digital, or at least have used a miniature instead of a full-size train. Like compare it to the train crash in Back to the Future 3. This was a miniature rigged with explosives, and that's it. I can guarantee that this cost a fraction of this setup, and it also didn't require countless hours of VFX work to digitally replace the entire landscape. So unlike the examples we looked at earlier where the digital complements the practical to give the best of both worlds, here, from a filmmaking point of view, you kind of end up with the worst of both worlds. You have the expense and impracticality of building and filming a big showstopper stunt like this for real, but then you also have the expense and time involved with the CGI needed to make it actually work in the context of the movie. So it ends up being twice as expensive, taking twice as long, being twice as much work, but it still ends up looking pretty much the same as if you had done it another cheaper way, like compositing in a miniature, or, dare I say it, doing it all digitally. So why did they do it for real? It's not for any of the reasons we talked about in part 3, because the underlying purpose for everything we talked about in part 3 was to deliver the most realistic stunt in the final movie. Who cares if it's digital or a miniature or fully in camera? The how doesn't matter. What matters is how it looks in the movie. Case in point, remember the plane crash in Tenet? You know, where they actually crashed the full-size jet plane into the building for real? Well, the reason they did that was because that actually worked out to be the cheapest option. Nolan has spoken about the fact that throughout pre-production, they had planned to do that scene with a combination of miniature and visual effects, like he did in Inception, or in Interstellar, or in The Dark Knight. So when making Tenet, he planned to approach the scene in the same way. It was only when they crunched the numbers that they realized it would actually be cheaper to do it for real.
When we priced it out relative to building the set for the interior, building the set for the exterior, building a miniature, CG, etc., when we added it all up, we realized that it was actually going to be cheaper and more efficient to buy the plane. And
yes, Christopher Nolan likes to do everything in camera, but his primary ambition is to make something that looks real within the confines of the movie's budget, and he is comfortable using all of the filmmaking tools at his disposal to do that. It just so happened that in this case, doing it with a life-size plane was the best option on both counts, and so that's why they did it like this. but it did get a hell of a lot of free publicity, didn't it? So call me cynical, but I think the reason they crashed a full-size train in Dead Reckoning, even though they knew 95% of the shot would be digital, is not because they thought it would look better than if they did it with a miniature. It was so that they could add it to the catalogue of marketing material for the movie about how much it was all done for real and get a whole bunch of free publicity because look, they crashed a train for real. This is why they needed Tom Cruise to bike off the cliff and do the base jump in one stunt, rather than splitting it into two separate ones. It's more impressive in a marketing featurette like this one if he does the whole thing in one go, even if it's completely possible to do it just as convincingly and practically in another way. And then, if anyone tries to criticize the stunt for looking fake, everyone can turn around and say, no, they actually did it for real. But as I hope this video has shown, there's a huge difference between saying you crashed a plane for real and then it looks like this in the final movie, to saying you crashed a train for real and it looks like this in the final movie. Dead Reckoning is a movie that is more than willing to recreate this entire train digitally where it needs to, and it is also willing to completely replace every single element of the original shot except the train, or to create a shot that is 100% digital. So there is no way that they filmed this in this way because the filmmakers thought it would be the most realistic looking option. They did it so that they could make this advert, starring Tom Cruise even though he absolutely doesn't need to be there for this, and have it shared far and wide across the internet for free. And to me, that is why these stunts feel so different from the other Mission Impossible stunts. These stunts were all designed and filmed in a way that would maximize the realism and excitement of the stunt when we watched them in the movie theater. These stunts were designed and filmed in a way that would maximize the amount of marketing the studio could get out of them. So if the main motivation for studios to do things like this for real becomes that they can say they did it for real and create a bunch of free advertising, then I am worried that if movies like Dead Reckoning and The Fall Guy that put this practical stunt work at the center of their marketing campaigns underperform, then risk-averse studios will see that as an excuse to not bother doing any big stunt for real. Especially if these scenes are being designed in a way that requires them to spend a huge amount of the budget on digital effects anyway. Because I think filmmakers can still point to this, or this, or this, or this, and convince a studio that the best way to do it convincingly is to do it for real. But that sell becomes much harder when you're talking about this and this, because of the double cost of the stunt itself and the VFX work. And more than that, if studios continue to blur the lines between real stunts and stunts that rely heavily on digital effects when they market their movies, then audiences will eventually stop responding to that because the realism is not paying off on screen. And if audiences stop responding to movies being marketed as real, then studios will want to stop paying to do things for real. They'll say, look, turns out audiences don't really care about practical stunts, and besides, even Mission Impossible just uses CGI for half of it anyway, so why not just do the whole thing in a computer and save us all a huge amount of money in the process? And as we have seen in this video, there are heaps of very good reasons to keep doing stunts for real, and it would absolutely suck if they stopped. And thankfully, a lot of influential filmmakers continue to push for this because by and large, they and audiences think it results in a better movie. This video has cherry-picked some examples to make a point, but I hope it has also shown a whole lot of cases where the results of the realism completely pays off on screen, and audiences have responded to that realism, even in cases where digital effects are being used just as much as they are in shots like this one and this one. Because despite all the advancements in CGI, it is still possible to do big, groundbreaking and impressive stunts, and movies should continue to push the boundaries of what's possible to deliver us the best entertainment they can. But if they are going to go to all of that effort, then they should do it in a way that actually pays off for the audience in the movie theater. So when we ask ourselves the question, what is a real stunt? Well, the answer is one that feels real. As I said right at the start of this video, movies and stunt work have always been about creating convincing illusions, and ironically enough, because we are now living at a time when these illusions are easier to create than ever before, pulling off something in a way that still feels real is harder than ever before. So I want to see marketing that acknowledges and celebrates the full suite of talents required to bring a movie to life, not featurettes like this one that deliberately mislead audiences and completely sideline the visual effects artists who worked just as hard on that scene. The stunts in this scene are impressive, so are the visual effects to make those stunts safe to film and believable in the final movie. So please, filmmakers and studios, stop trying to trick us with clever marketing. Just focus on making a good movie. Audiences just want the movie itself to feel real, which is what we have always felt, and for the most part, we don't actually care how the sausage gets made so long as the end result looks good and most importantly, is entertaining. If for some reason you still want to hear me talk about this, then I have uploaded the companion video onto my Patreon, which looks specifically at the vault scene in Fast 5. That's another scene that was mostly done for real, but I think it ends up looking kind of fake because of how it is shot and edited. The video compares the shaky cam style of action filmmaking in that to movies like the Bourne films and Baby Driver that do it properly. It was a segment that didn't really fit into this main video, but I still wanted to talk about it because it is an important part of why some real stunts still end up looking fake. So go and check out the Patreon, where you can sign up for as little as $1. Thank you for watching, and a special thank you to my patrons. You are the CGI ramp that makes my base jump possible.